long before anyone ever walked the crumbling paths of Hallownest with a nail in hand, the world beneath the ground was quieter, simpler, almost empty of stories. There were only scattered tribes of small creatures moving through soil and stone, sleeping when darkness settled over them, and dreaming without knowing why. Above their dreams, in a realm made of light and memory rather than stone, there rested a being whose presence felt like dawn itself, held in a single shape. This was the Radiance, an old, higher light that watched over the moths, and through them brushed the thoughts of many other bugs. And while you're settling in, if you're enjoying this soft, drifting tale so far, do take a moment to like and subscribe, and comment which lore or story do you want to hear next. The Moth tribe worshipped her in an age when there was no Hallownest, no city of tears, no white palaces or crumbling crossroads, only a scattered world where minds were still soft and hazy, like fog lying low over the ground. In those days, the Radiance was not merely a statue or a half-forgotten symbol. She filled the dreams of the moths with warm, golden visions, teaching them through images rather than words. When they slept, her light reached down like gentle lantern beams spread over a dark field, guiding their small souls. But to be remembered was everything to her. She was a being of pure light and pride, and every whispered prayer, every tiny bow of a moth's masked head, folded itself into the quiet joy of her existence. If someone could have stood in that dream realm and listened, they might have heard the faint murmurs of devotion, a constant hum like the softest chorus, although half of those prayers were simply asking for a little less danger and a little more food. The land itself lay mostly untamed. There were other kingdoms out there, distant and mysterious, but the stretch of earth that would someday be called Hallownest was still only a wasteland of stone and dust, wide and lifeless on the surface, hollow and waiting below. There were no maps to mark it, no signposts, only dry winds and empty horizons. If a wanderer had somehow asked for directions in that age, the only answer would have been another hill, another rock, and perhaps a confused beetle pointing in every direction at once. Deep below, caverns yawned in silence, their ceilings dripping with mineral tears, their floors layered with age-old dust, ready to receive whatever future might choose to settle there. Then, from somewhere beyond the edge of all that dust and silence, something vast approached. It was not a king walking on legs, not a small creature finding its way, but a colossal being that stretched across the land like a living line of prophecy. This was the Worm, an ancient creature of immense power, whose long, pale body carved a path through the lifeless wastes. It moved with a purpose that no one else could yet understand, driven by knowledge of things that had not happened, but were already written somewhere in the deep patterns of fate. The Worm saw what this empty land could become, saw a kingdom not of brute instinct, but of thought, of laws, of memory carefully arranged, instead of left to drift. In time, the Worm reached the end of its long journey and did something that most creatures would have found unthinkable. It died, or rather, it shed its old, impossible form. From that ending stepped a much smaller figure, white and slight, with a crown not of metal, but of innate authority. This being was the Pale King, the Worm reborn into a shape that could walk among the lesser bugs, instead of looming above them like a pale horizon. It was a little like a mountain, deciding it would be easier to help travelers if it turned into a bridge instead. The Pale King carried within him the knowledge and power of the world, but he chose to compress all that vastness into a form that could sit among his subjects rather than simply tower over their entire world. He descended below the surface into the waiting caverns, and there he began his work. One by one, tribes of bugs from across the surrounding lands came to him, drawn by a promise that sounded like a miracle. The Pale King offered them something precious and strange: higher thought, a sharper, clearer mind, a chance to rise beyond their old instincts and the vague, drifting dreams that had guided them before. In exchange, they would join his kingdom, binding themselves to his rule. Many accepted. Beetles, mantises, mushrooms, and other creatures gathered beneath his banner, reshaping themselves under his influence. A kingdom began to grow downward rather than upward, streets carved into stone, chambers hollowed out and lined with pale architecture, paths that wound like threads they hoped would never break. As the kingdom formed, the Pale King raised halls of gleaming white, and in time, he built a shining domain called the White Palace, a seat of power that seemed to deny the darkness all around it. Above and below, the land changed. The surface remained mostly barren, but under the earth, life condensed into an ordered maze of roads and walls and homes. The City of Tears rose in a vast cavern where endless rain fell from the ceiling like a sky that had forgotten how to stop weeping. Those who lived there learned to walk with purpose, to think in complicated ways, to work, to build, to dream of advancement instead of simply survival. It was a grand experiment, a kingdom of insects raised to something like nobility by the will of a former worm who now sat on a throne that was less a seat and more a careful promise that he would stay. Yet, far above in the realm of dreams, the Radiance watched all of this with growing unease. Her moths, once devoted and constant, began to turn their attention to a new figure. The Pale King, with his gift of higher thought, offered them a different kind of light, a pale, focused glow that promised clarity instead of comfort. Temples to the old dreamlight fell quiet. Shrines that had once thrummed with golden presence became still. The Moth tribe, in time, chose to abandon their former goddess and bow to the Pale King's new order. For beings of flesh and shell, this shift felt gradual, like the slow turning of a season. For a being of pure light whose existence depended on memory and worship, it felt like a cliff falling away in a single instant. The Radiance did not vanish. A being like her did not simply drift out, like a candle in a breeze. Instead, she receded, pulling back into the deeper folds of the dream realm. Her image lingered in statues, in faint carvings, in the memories of a few who still remembered the old warmth. Somewhere, a shrine remained dedicated to her alone, the Moth tribe's last quiet confession that they had once loved another light. But in halls and cities across the kingdom, bugs now spoke of the Pale King, of his wisdom, of the order he brought. If they ever mentioned their former goddess, it was as a relic, a forgotten chapter. The Radiance, who had once filled the night with gentle visions, became a story told less and less often, a name that slipped from tongues like dust. To the Pale King's new subjects, this change seemed only natural. Life improved in many ways. They had structure, shelter, roads to walk instead of endless wilderness. Guards patrolled, records were kept, laws were written. Even if most bugs did not enjoy paperwork, the Pale King had at least proven that someone did, somewhere in the depths of his administration. Hallownest, as it came to be called, grew into a true kingdom, its sigil stamped on walls and gates, its promise carved into stone, a land of mind and order beneath the earth, ruled by a king who had come from beyond their understanding to lift them up. But in the quiet corners of dreams, where old light still burned like an ember, the Radiance remembered everything. She remembered every bowed head, every whispered prayer, every moth who had once looked up to her with absolute trust. For her, those memories were not past. They were the very fabric of her being. To be forgotten was not simply an insult. It was an erasure, a soft unmaking. And as Hallownest prospered, as more and more minds turned away from her towards the Pale King's pale design, something inside that old light began to twist, not in the gentle loops of guiding dreams, but in sharper, angrier coils. In a kingdom that believed it had moved neatly from old ways into new, a forgotten radiance lingered, quietly refusing to accept that it had been left behind. In a kingdom that believed it had moved neatly from old ways into new, a forgotten radiance lingered, quietly refusing to accept that it had been left behind. In the far corners of the dream realm, where the minds of sleeping bugs brushed together like drifting leaves, the old light waited and listened. She heard no prayers said in her name, no songs sung beneath her statues. The moths, who had once devoted their whole existence to her, had turned inward, retreating to quiet places, and even they spoke more often of the Pale King's wisdom than of the warmth that had once filled their dreams. Yet traces of her remained. In a quiet cemetery carved deep below the surface, where gravestones leaned together in soft rows and pale flowers glowed faintly in the gloom, a single great statue of a many-rayed moth watched over the resting grounds. At its base, a few remaining members of the moth tribe still came from time to time, not to worship in the old way, but to remember that there had been another light once. Their memory was blurred, like a painting left out in the rain, but the feeling of it remained, stubborn and gentle. They did not know that each small act of remembrance tugged faintly at the beings still curled in the dream realm, the way a bell rope tugs at a distant chime. For the Radiance, memory was not simply a comfort, it was her foundation. To be honored, to be recalled, to be dreamed of, these things were as necessary to her as soil was to a root. As those threads thinned, she felt herself dimming, not in brightness, but in certainty. The kingdom below the surface filled with new structures and new loyalties, and above it all, the Pale King's image fixed itself firmly in the hearts and minds of his subjects. Eventually, the old light could bear it no longer. Somewhere in the golden depths of her realm, pride and hurt coiled together like twin rays of a harsh sun, and she reached back toward those who had forgotten. At first, her return was not a blazing storm, but a whisper. Dreamers in Hallownest began to see flashes of an impossible sun when they closed their eyes at night, a radiance too bright to look at directly. The light did not ask politely this time. It pressed, insisting that they remember, insisting that they had once bowed to another. Some woke with their masks damp from tears they could not explain. Others stirred uneasily, feeling as if someone had stood at the foot of their bed all night, waiting for an answer that never came. If anyone mentioned it over morning tea, they often laughed it off as a strange dream, although a few started sleeping with their lanterns lit, as if that small flame could stand between them and something older. The Radiance, denied worship and place, turned her light more forcefully. She began to reach not only into dreams, but through them, pushing her presence into waking minds. The result was not peaceful illumination. Thoughts twisted under that glare. Bugs who had once gone calmly about their work started to falter. A miner paused mid-swing in Crystal Peak, staring into the darkness as orange motes drifted at the edge of her vision. A humble villager in what would one day be called the crossroads found his hands trembling as he tried to sweep his doorway, suddenly sure that someone was whispering instructions in a language made entirely of light. The Radiance was trying to reassert herself, to reclaim what had been hers, and the fragile minds she seized did not bend gracefully under the strain. Slowly, a sickness began to take shape, although it did not look like any illness that had come before. It glowed when it settled in a host, the eyes filled with a deep orange gleam, as if little suns had taken root behind the glass of their masks. Thoughts muddled and looped. Peaceful workers turned frantic, repeating the same motions, the same muttered phrases, as though caught in a dream they could not wake from. It smelled faintly of heat and dust, like air too long trapped behind a window in high summer. Those who still remembered the Radiance's old warmth could almost taste the familiarity, but it had become something harsher, like sunlight that no longer knew when to soften. The Pale King could not ignore this. From his white palace, high above the rest of the kingdom, in its own strange plane, he watched his people and saw the signs of intrusion. Reports came from distant outposts, workers refusing orders, guards standing stock still for hours, their eyes burning orange, small creatures wandering into dangerous tunnels, as if following a call only they could hear. His promise had been higher thought, ordered minds, a kingdom lifted out of instinct. Now those minds were being used as doorways by a being he had hoped would be forgotten. It was a bitter realization, rather like discovering that the locks you proudly invented were exactly the sort of puzzle an old rival enjoyed breaking. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that this was not a mere disease of the body. It was an infection of will, a corruption of thought itself. The Radiance, old and proud, was trying to overwrite the kingdom he had built, to reclaim her place by seizing the very minds he had refined. His early efforts were defensive: containment, walls, watchers, restrictions on travel, quiet orders passed through his court that certain shrines should be destroyed, certain symbols scraped away, certain stories left untold. But it is difficult to erase a story that lives in the dark spaces of sleep. Even shattered statues leave dust behind, and dust remembers where it once belonged. The Pale King needed something the Radiance could not twist. She worked through dreams, through memory, through the spark of individuality he himself had given to his subjects. If he wanted to stop her, he would have to turn away from those same gifts. Somewhere beneath Hallownest, deeper than its cities and crossroads, deeper even than its ancient waterways and catacombs, there was another kind of power. The void, a black, hungry substance that did not think, did not dream, and did not care. It pooled in a place that would come to be known as the Abyss, a vast chasm lined with jagged walls, its floor lost beneath churning, ink-dark depths. The void fascinated the Pale King and unsettled others. To stand at the edge of the abyss was to feel something pulling at you, not with emotion, but with absence. It was like staring into a mirror that refused to show your reflection. The king, who had once been a vast worm stretching across the land, now gazed down into that still, dark sea and saw a different kind of infinity, one that did not offer knowledge or light, but pure negation. He realized that in a battle against a being of light and memory, something that possessed neither might serve as a perfect prism. It would not converse with the Radiance, nor be persuaded, nor be deceived. It would simply contain. From this thought, a plan took shape, cold and precise. If the Radiance spread by seizing living minds, then he would create beings that had almost none. He would craft vessels, children born of the void and shaped in his image, blank of will, empty of self, barely more than shells, yet still alive enough to hold something within. They would be sent up from the abyss, like pale seeds dredged from black water, each one a potential cage for the Radiance's burning presence. It was a terrible idea, and he pursued it with terrible calm. The White Lady, his queen, felt the weight of what he intended. She was a higher being herself, more rooted in growth and gentleness than in rigid order. Where he saw a necessary sacrifice, she saw an orchard of potential lives being planted only to be cut down. Still, she lent him her strength in part, weaving aspects of her own power into the vessels, hoping that at least one might endure. The plan was cruel, but the Radiance's infection was already reshaping Hallownest's future, and a kingdom built so carefully would not be surrendered easily by the one who had raised it. So the Pale King opened the way to the abyss. The path led down through oppressive stone, past walls streaked with dark residue, to a mouth of a chasm that felt like standing on the lip of a swallowed world. There, under his direction, the process began. From the void, small, pale forms began to arise, tiny figures with blank faces and horns like his own, their eyes empty, their movements halting. They climbed and fell and climbed again, reaching toward a light that did not belong to them. Each one was a possible answer to the Radiance, and almost none of them were ever meant to be anything more. Each one was a possible answer to the Radiance, and almost none of them were ever meant to be anything more. They rose from the void like pale seedlings, their bodies shaped, but their minds hollow, blank as unwritten pages. They scrabbled at the stone, tiny hands grasping for any ledge, any purchase, as they climbed toward a narrow opening far above, where a harsh white light spilled down into the chasm. The climb itself was a kind of test. Those who lost their grip fell back into the black depths without a sound, reclaimed by the void as if they had never existed. Those who managed to cling to the walls left their small bodies scattered along the jagged platforms, crumpled and still like discarded shells washed up by a dark sea. The abyss did not mourn them. It did not understand loss. Its surface simply rippled and smoothed, waiting to send more pale shapes upward. Along the walls, countless empty masks stared out from where they had come to rest, eyes carved but never lit. If anyone from the City of Tears above could have seen it, they might have thought they had stumbled into a forgotten graveyard, but this was worse than a cemetery. In a graveyard, each stone marked a life that had been lived. Here, the small shapes lining the walls had never truly been allowed to begin. It was a place where potential had been measured, weighed, and then quietly thrown back into the dark. High above that churning black, the Pale King watched. He regarded the climb not with cruelty, but with a kind of distant necessity, like a physician's observing a painful treatment that he believed would save the patient. To him, each failed vessel was not a child, not a person, but an attempt, one more step toward forging the perfect container. The Radiance's infection spread through individuality, through the little sparks inside each mind that could remember and fear and love. The vessels, by design, had none of that. If one could be found that was truly empty, truly hollow, then the Radiance might be drawn into it and locked away, unable to twist what was not there. The process went on for a long time, the abyss filled with pale forms and quiet failures. The White Lady, feeling each loss as a faint ache, drew back more and more into her own gardens, weaving thorns and roots around her to soften the sorrow. She and the Pale King differed in how they saw those small shapes. To him, they were instruments. To her, they were lives that might have walked in the sunless streets above, could have spoken, could have laughed awkwardly at nothing in particular. It is difficult, even for higher beings, to agree perfectly on what is acceptable to sacrifice. In time, amid all those attempts, something changed. One vessel rose that was different, or at least the Pale King believed so. This child climbed from the void with steadier steps, its body perfectly formed, its mask uncracked, its gaze empty in exactly the way he desired. Where others stumbled, it did not. Where others reached out with a flicker of something more than blankness, this one moved with a calm that was almost chilling. It seemed to carry the void within it, like a stillness rather than a storm. This was the one he chose. This was the vessel that would later be known as the Hollow Knight. He took this chosen vessel from the abyss and brought it up into the White Palace. There the child remained at his side, raised not with warmth, but with careful distance. The Hollow Knight learned to move gracefully, to fight, to obey. It spoke little or not at all. There were no bedtime stories, no shared meals, no small mishaps that would have left crumbs on royal robes or ink on unsteady hands. The Pale King watched constantly for any sign of imperfection, a stray emotion, a moment of hesitation, a glimmer of individuality that might give the Radiance anything to grasp. He saw none, or at least convinced himself that he did not. It was easier that way, easier to believe that all of this had led to a perfect answer. Down below, the abyss remained sealed, and within it, countless other vessels remained, broken or motionless. Among them was one small figure that had managed to climb higher than most before being cast aside, a vessel that would, in another age, awaken and step back into the world. For now it lay among the rest, only another pale shape in a place where the walls remembered more than any living citizen of Hallownest knew. The kingdom above went on with its routines, its reign, its slow drift toward the quiet tragedy waiting on the horizon. When the infection worsened, the Pale King finally set his plan into motion. The Radiance's light burned hotter, spreading through the dreams of his people. Orange blossoms of corruption appeared in bodies and buildings alike. Masks cracked under the strain of minds pulled in directions they could not endure. Out in forgotten roads and sleepy villages, bugs who had once merely gone about their days began to mutter to themselves, to claw at their own heads, to wander into places from which they never returned. The king's defenders fought not only enemies, but their own loved ones, seeing the orange glow in their eyes, and knowing that to let them live freely was to let the infection spread. To stop this, the Hollow Knight was prepared for its purpose. A great temple was constructed in the heart of the kingdom, a smooth, egg-shaped chamber known as the Temple of the Black Egg. It lay at the center of what would one day be called the Forgotten Crossroads, though at the time it was still a place of movement and life. Within that temple, the Hollow Knight would be chained, not with iron alone, but with chains woven of seal and spell and sacrifice. It was built as a living lock. When filled with the Radiance, the vessel would trap her power inside itself, cutting her off from the minds she sought to claim. The moment of binding was not gentle. The Radiance, forced into the Hollow Knight, burned and struggled like a sun suddenly pressed into a narrow shell. The higher beings of Hallownest, the Pale King, the Dreamers, those chosen to assist in maintaining the seal, joined their powers to complete the prison. Monomon the Teacher, Lurien the Watcher, and Hera the Beast each agreed to become living seals themselves, giving up their places in the waking world to sink into enchanted sleep. Their dreams would be nails driven into the Radiance's cage, holding it shut. It was not a plan that left much room for joy. When it was done, the kingdom seemed for a time to grow still again. The Radiance's reach receded, trapped within the Hollow Knight's body deep in the temple. The infection that had spread through Hallownest slowed and quieted. Those who survived went back to their tasks, though always with a sense that something had broken that could not quite be named. The Hollow Knight stood in the heart of the temple, impaled on chains of spellcraft, containing within its hollow form a seething light that had once been worshipped as a goddess. The Pale King looked upon his work and allowed himself to believe it had succeeded. This is a real lore truth. The Hollow Knight was intended to be a pure vessel, devoid of will, so that it could perfectly contain the Radiance. But perfection is easier to name than to achieve. Somewhere in the shaping of the Hollow Knight, some small flaw remained. Perhaps it was a lingering fragment of self where there was supposed to be none. Perhaps it was the influence of the White Lady's gentler power, or a quiet attachment formed in the palace that the Pale King refused to see. Whatever its source, the vessel was not as empty as he had hoped. Inside that shell, alongside the void meant to smother the Radiance, there was the faintest echo of feeling, thin as a whisper in a long hallway. And the Radiance, being what she was, found it. The infection but did not vanish entirely. It slept, then stirred, seeped, and recoiled in waves. Cracks formed in the vessel's mask. In the depths of the temple, the Hollow Knight's once silent body began to shudder and cry out, its posture no longer entirely under control. The Radiance pressed against the boundaries of her prison, and that tiny imperfection of self inside the vessel gave her just enough purchase to ride. The chains held, but they groaned. Outside, Hallownest began to notice that the sickness was not gone, only quieter, more insidious. It drifted back through tunnels in chambers like dust that would not stay swept. The Pale King understood then that his great answer was incomplete. Hallownest was not saved, it was only delayed. The kingdom, which had seemed so solid with its carved sigils and ordered streets, now hung over a slow, unseen collapse. The king retreated further into the White Palace, into hidden layers of reality where few could follow. The dreamers remained asleep, their minds pinned into place as living locks. The citizens above watched their world sink into stillness. Roads emptied, shops closed, guards' posts were abandoned as their keepers either died, wandered away, or simply sat down one day and did not get up again. The City of Tears lived up to its name in more than one way. Over time, Hallownest became a kingdom of echoes. The infection spread in uneven patches. Here are a cluster of frantic glowing husks. There a quiet ruin where everything had stopped, as if time itself had decided to rest. Statues cracked, paths crumbled. In the outskirts, in places like Green Path and Deepnest, native life continued in its own fierce way. But even there, the influence of the failing kingdom could be felt like a distant drum. The great experiment of the Pale King had not ended in a clean victory. It had dimmed into a long, uneasy silence, as though the entire realm were holding its breath. For a long while, nothing new seemed to begin. The Hollow Knight remained chained in the temple, screaming soundlessly in a prison that shook but did not yet shatter. The Radiance burned inside, furious and trapped. The Pale King faded from memory, his image left only in statues and half-remembered tales. Hallownest slipped from a living kingdom into a fallen one, its stories becoming the kind that dust tells to itself when no one is listening. And yet, in the deepest darkness of the abyss, where so many attempts had been abandoned, one small vessel that had once been cast aside stirred again, as if some quiet call had reached it at last. That small vessel had lain among the others for so long that the abyss itself had seemed to have forgotten it. Its body was as pale as all the rest, mask smooth, horns short and unremarkable. Around it, still forms leaned against stone or lay half submerged in the black surface below, each one a discarded answer to a desperate question. The void lapped quietly at the ledges, more like a heavy breath than a sea, rising and falling in slow, patient motions. Nothing moved until something did. The vessel stirred. It was not a dramatic awakening. There was no sudden gasp, no blazing light, only a small tightening of hands, a faint flex in limbs that had never been given a proper childhood. The vessel's head lifted. Empty black eyes opened, not to see in the way other creatures saw, but to notice that there was at last a difference between lying still and standing. It pushed itself up, joints protesting like hinges that had been closed too long. For a moment it swayed, as if the weight of simply being was almost too much. Then, drawn by something distant and insistent, a call, a memory, a promise, it began to climb. The abyss watched in its own indifferent way as the small figure stepped from one jagged ledge to the next. It slipped once, sliding on grit toward the waiting void, but a hand caught a jut of stone, almost absently, as though some buried instinct remembered this climb from another time. The walls of the chasm felt like a history book written in masks and broken forms. The vessel passed others that resembled it closely, blank faces turned forever toward nothing. It did not stop to look. There was nothing here for it now, Nothing except the sense that up meant away, and away meant something like freedom. At the top of the abyss, the path narrowed into a stone throat. The vessel squeezed through and emerged into a chamber of dark stone and faint, pale light. Behind it, a massive door of bone and shell stood closed, marked with a sigil it did not yet bear, sealed against whatever might try to re-enter from above. In another age, that door would not open again without the king's brand, the mark of Hallownest's monarch. For now, the vessel slipped out past the last remnants of the Pale King's careful geometry and into the wider Underkingdom without fanfare, small and unnoticed, as if the fate of a realm could easily fit into a body no larger than a child. It wandered. The paths it took in those early days were never recorded. No mapmaker humming in the tunnels to trace them. No chronicler leaning over a desk to ink them in careful lines. Perhaps it moved through the distant caverns where roots hung heavy and glowing plants lit the way. Perhaps it skirted the edges of Deepnest, feeling the tremor of vast spiders in the stone and choosing different routes with the quiet wisdom of someone who did not wish to be eaten before breakfast. It had no name, no title, no clear purpose beyond the pull in its chest that said, "Not here, not yet, keep going." Eventually, the vessel reached the surface. It climbed up through broken stone and thin soil until one day its head rose into cold air under a sky that felt enormous after so much ceiling. The land up there was not kind. A dry, wind-scoured place stretched out, where cliffs cracked the horizon and sparse grass clung stubbornly to the earth. The vessel walked across those wastes, small silhouette against a world that barely noticed it. Somewhere far behind, the kingdom it had been made to save, or to be thrown away for, sank deeper into ruin. Somewhere ahead, the call that tugged at it quieted for a time, like a bell that had not yet decided to ring. Out in that desolation, the vessel changed in ways even it did not understand. Memories of the abyss became softer, fogged at the edges, more feeling than picture. The pressure of the Pale King's will faded, leaving behind only the faint outline of the shape he had intended. The vessel learned to move without direction, to exist without orders, to rest when exhaustion demanded it. It picked up a nail, a simple, slender weapon compared to the grand arms of Hallownest's knights, and learned to swing it with precision. The world did not suddenly become gentle, but it became survivable. Days passed, seasons perhaps, though in such a place the difference between one cold wind and the next could blur. Then the call returned. It came not as a voice, but as a tremor deep in whatever passed for the vessel's heart. Far away, in the forgotten depths of Hallownest, the Radiance struggled harder against her prison. The Hollow Knight's shell cracked further. Infection seeped out, pushing through stone and dream alike. Each flare of that anguished light sent echoes through the void-born siblings scattered across reality. Being one of those echoes reached the little wanderer out in the wastes. The vessel paused mid-step, nail tips sinking into the dust, and turned toward a direction it had not been consciously aware of holding in mind. It walked. The path led back toward the place it had once escaped, the old entrance to Hallownest, where cliffs rose like broken teeth around a narrow gorge. The sky grew closer, clouds hanging low and heavy. At the edge of a chasm, the vessel's foot slipped. The ground gave way beneath it, and in a flurry of dust and stone, it fell. The drop seemed endless, a plunge through darkness lit here and there by faintly glowing plants and the ghosts of old pathways. When the vessel finally struck the bottom, it rose again without complaint. Falling, after all, was something it had practiced in the abyss. The place where it landed lay near a small, crumbling town at the edge of the Old Kingdom, a settlement that clung to existence with the stubbornness of a single candle in a drafty room. This was Dirtmouth, perched at the lip of a well that plunged down into Hallownest's heart. Its streets were nearly empty. Houses leaned together for support, shutters hanging crooked, windows dark. Only one figure sat there, wrapped in a warm cloak, hunched beside the well as if keeping company with its silence. An old beetle looked up as the vessel approached, his eyes bright with the peculiar hope of someone who has seen too many travelers leave and too few return. He spoke to the stranger with a gentleness that suggested he had rehearsed these words many times. The kingdom below was dangerous, he said, fallen and sick. Many had gone down, drawn by stories of treasure, of glory, of answers to questions only old kingdoms know how to ask. Few had come back. Still, if the little wanderer wished to descend, he would not stop it. The well stood open, a throat leading straight into the forgotten crossroads. The old beetle's name was Elderbug, and at that time he truly was the last remaining resident of Dirtmouth, loyal to a town that had mostly vanished around him. The vessel listened, quiet as always. No grand speech rose to its lips, no declaration. It stepped past Elderbug, paused at the edge of the well, and looked down into the darkness. There was nothing visible there, only the promise of death. Without ceremony, it jumped. The air rushed past, cool and damp compared to the dry wastes above. Walls flickered by, glimpses of old bricks and roots, until at last the vessel landed in a soft drift of soil and stone at the bottom. Above, the circle of light from the well's mouth shone faintly, like a distant moon already half forgotten. Ahead lay tunnels, wide, cracked, lined with the remnants of signs and carved stones. Once they had been busy crossroads, where bugs passed one another with greetings and errands. Now they stretched out, echoing and thin, filled with the rustle of small things and the faint, unsettling sound of distant groans. The vessel walked forward, nail in hand. Shapes moved in the dimness, husks of former citizens, bodies still walking but hollowed out by infection. Their eyes burned orange, their movements jerky. When they saw the stranger, they staggered forward, arms reaching not in welcome but in mindless aggression. The vessel swung the nail. Each strike was clean and precise, more an act of necessity than anger. When the husks fell, they crumbled into dust and faint motes of orange light that drifted upward for a moment before thinning away, as if trying to return to a sun that no longer remembered them. As the vessel traveled deeper into the forgotten crossroads, it found small signs that it was not entirely alone. A bench sat in a quiet nook, worn smooth by use, still inviting any wanderer to sit and rest as if time had not passed. Farther on, a soft humming floated through the air, a tune as round and content as someone counting their own coins. Around a corner, a rotund figure with a large pack and an ever-present quill was busy sketching the tunnels with evident satisfaction. Cornifer the cartographer sold maps to those who crossed his path, as pleased to see a new customer as if the kingdom had never fallen apart around him. It was one of Hallownest's small kindnesses that even in ruin, there was always someone ready to offer directions, as long as one had enough geo. The vessel took the map, tracing routes with a finger, learning the shape of this first layer of the underground. Beneath Dirtmouth, the forgotten crossroads sprawled like a faded memory of a market square, its doors sealed, its signs fallen, its inhabitants reduced to echo and instinct. Yet paths led onward, down toward the green, misted caverns of green path, deeper into the restless tunnels of the fungal wastes, sideways into places where old trains had once thundered, and much farther toward the city of tears, still weeping eternally in its cavern of rain. Each route was a thread tugging the little wanderer farther into the story that had been waiting for it since the day the abyss first opened. In those early steps, the vessel was still only that, a small figure with a nail and a call it did not fully understand. It did not yet know that it would come to be called the night, that it would confront the Radiance herself in the core of a dream, or that its choices would determine whether Hallownest's lingering agony would finally end or simply change shape. For now, it walked through quiet tunnels, fought husks that had once been neighbors and friends to someone, and rested on benches where the silence felt almost companionable. The kingdom might have forgotten its own stories, but the stories had not forgotten this small wanderer who had returned from the dark. The night, small, as pale, and wordless, moved deeper into the forgotten crossroads, its footsteps soft on the cracked stone. The tunnels branched like old thoughts, every path leading to some forgotten corner of the kingdom. It learned quickly that not all dangers announced themselves with roaring or rattling armor. Some shuffled, some crawled, some simply dropped from the ceiling at the worst possible moment, like very impolite ceiling decorations. Each time, the nail flashed and another husk or beast fell still, leaving only drifting particles of orange and a silence that felt somehow heavier than before. Soon, the night found a structure that hinted at the old life of Hallownest, a temple of sorts, quiet and sealed. Inside, a figure slept in a stone chamber, mask heavy, form wrapped in age and stillness. Approaching it felt like walking into a room where someone had been thinking for a very long time and simply never stopped. But before that mystery could unfold, another power called out elsewhere. A passage opened toward a new land, where the air grew moist and green. Beyond the crumbling stone and gray dust of the crossroads lay green path, a place that seemed to belong to a different world. Moss draped the walls like thick blankets. Glowing plants cast a soft light, and water pooled in quiet basins. Everything had the dense, breathing presence of a forest that had grown over whatever had once stood there. The night picked its way along narrow ledges and vine-covered platforms, while odd, plant-like creatures leapt and spat and defended their home with surprising enthusiasm, as if they had not received the memo about the kingdom above falling into ruin. Through the mist and foliage, a figure flashed by from time to time, tall compared to the night, agile, masked, and carrying a needle in place of a nail. She moved with a confidence that belonged to someone who had long ago decided there was nothing down here that could truly frighten her. This was Hornet, guardian and hunter, watching the newcomer as one might watch a stray spark wandering too close to dry kindling. She did not greet the night immediately, Instead, she observed, tested from a distance, letting the wanderer prove that it could survive the living traps of Greenpath before she bothered to speak. When they finally met properly, it was on a broad platform choked with vines, the air thick with the scent of damp plant life. Hornet stood poised, her needle held with the easy familiarity of a seasoned fighter. Her voice, when she spoke, carried both challenge and something like reluctant curiosity. She called the night ghost, as if seeing in it not a person, but a remnant, an echo of something that should have stayed buried. She knew more than she said, and in that first clash between needle and nail, she tested not only the knight's strength, but its right to even be walking the tunnels of Hallownest at all. The battle was swift and sharp. Hornet leapt and darted, her needle whistling through the air, while the knight answered with quick strikes and patient timing. Each blow exchanged was a question. Who are you? Why are you here? What do you carry from the abyss? In the end, the knight endured. Hornet fell back, breathing hard, looking at this small, wordless figure with something that might have been respect or alarm or a mixture of both. She spoke of the kingdom's ruin, of the danger that still lay at its heart, and of the role the knight might be stepping into, whether it understood it or not. There is a true lore detail hidden in that encounter. Hornet herself was born from an agreement between Hera the Beast, one of the three dreamers, and the Pale King. She is the daughter of a higher being and a great warrior, and in her veins runs a lineage tied directly to Hallownest's strange, sorrowful royalty. That is why she moves with such confidence, why she guards the kingdom's fate so fiercely, and why she looks at the night with the complicated gaze of someone staring at both a sibling and a weapon. Having proven itself to Hornet, for now the night pressed onward. Greenpath's lush growth gave way to other lands, the fungal wastes with their bouncing spores and booming fungi, a place that seemed equal parts dangerous and determined to smell peculiar. The roads once used by the old stagways, where an ancient stag still lived, ready to bear travelers between long-forgotten stations. Awakening that stag was like waking a memory, with legs and a powerful sense of direction. Each time the knight rang one of his bells, the old creature responded with a mix of pride and surprise, pleased that someone still remembered to use the paths carved in age gone by. Through exploration and in battle, the knight gathered more than geo and scars. It found charms, little artifacts that resonated with aspects of its own being, enhancing its abilities, bending the rules of how its nail moved, how its body endured, how its soul gathered and flowed. It learned spells from a snail shaman who lived in a dim chamber and looked as though he had long ago made peace with the idea that knocking visitors unconscious was a fair way to share gifts of power. The knight learned to focus soul to heal, to release it in blasts of energy, to reach where its nail could not. With every step, it became more capable of walking the kingdom's ruined veins without being swallowed. In the depths of the fungal wastes and beyond into the city of tears, clues accumulated like dust on old shelves. A grand city lay at the heart of Hallownest, forever drowned in rain that fell from a fall sky, a ceiling of stone above, where reservoirs emptied themselves constantly. The city of tears was beautiful even in decay. High spires, graceful arches, windows lit by weak blue luminescence. but its streets were filled with husks, its noble districts crumbled, and its guards wandered in infected stupor, still carrying spears they no longer truly remembered how to use. As the night climbed those wet streets, crossing fragile bridges and leaping between rooftops, the kingdom's story came into clearer view. Statues of the Pale King stood in plazas, his likeness carved into coins and seals. Tablets recounted his promise of higher thought and his command over the land. The further the night went, the more it could feel how much pride had once been stored here, how much faith had been poured into the idea that this place would stand forever. Now, the only constant sound was the rain, tapping on broken glass, dripping from gutters, pooling in hollows where once there had been life. Somewhere in the city, hidden behind locked doors and guarded chambers, waited the Soul Sanctum, an academic arena where scholars had once tried to push the boundaries of spirit and power. They had experimented with soul, that shimmering essence drawn from living beings, trying to achieve something like immortality, or at least an enduring mind. The night pushed through their twisted remnants, facing foes who floated and struck with spells, their bodies warped by misused soul. The sanctum revealed another side of Hallownest's desperation. Even before the infection had fully taken hold, some within the kingdom were already trying dangerous paths to escape decay and death, as if the entire realm had sensed the foundations beginning to tremble. Deeper into the city, beneath grand relics of rule, the knight found a chamber set aside not for research, but for rest of a stranger sort there, marked by dreamlike sigils and whispering light, lay one of the three great beings who maintained the seal on the hollow night, one of the dreamers. But before the knight could meaningfully approach that sleeping guardian, it needed a different tool, one that did not strike flesh or stone, but dreams themselves. Far above the city of tears, back toward the quieter parts of Hallownest, the knight was drawn to a place of graves and blue flowers, the resting grounds. There, in a soft, mist-filled veil, the dead were honored and laid to rest. A tram line crossed the far edge, long silent. At the center, beneath the watchful statue of a many-rayed moth, the knight descended into a hidden place where spirits gathered like flickers of pale fire. There it met the seer, a member of the moth tribe, who still remembered the Radiance, not as an infection, but as the old higher light they had once worshipped. The seer placed in the knight's hands a strange blade of dream stuff, the dream nail. With it, the knight could strike the sleeping and the haunted, not to harm them in body, but to pierce the veil of their thoughts and dreams. It could reveal hidden words, awaken long-buried memories, and most importantly, confront beings that existed partly or entirely in the dream realm. The seer spoke of the Radiance in hushed tones, explaining that the infection plaguing Hallownest was the work of that forgotten light, trying to reclaim the minds of the kingdom's people. She urged the knight to use the dream nail to gather essence, small fragments of lingering dreams, to strengthen its power so that in time the knight might reach the very heart of the infection. With the dream nail and an evolving understanding of Hallownest's tragedy, the knight's path narrowed toward a clear purpose. The dreamers, Monomon the teacher, Lurien the watcher, and Hera the beast, each slumbered in different corners of the kingdom, their dreams serving as the anchors that held the Radiance's prison in place. To face the source of the infection, the knight would have to enter those dreams and sever the chains one by one. It was a task both necessary and cruel. To free Hallownest from its slow, broken half-life, the knight needed to the very seals that still contained the Radiance. So the journey expanded outward yet again. The knight traveled to Fog Canyon, where electric jellyfish drifted through thick mist and archives waited underwater, to the Watcher's Spire, high above the City of Tears, where Lorien's gaze once watched over the whole realm, and to Deepnest, a place of shadows and spiders and whispered chittering that turned even brave hearts uneasy. Each region held not just enemies and hazards, but old choices, old loyalties, and echoes of the Pale King's long-reaching decisions. As the knight moved through them, it seemed less like a visitor and more like someone walking through the inside of a memory, one that had been left unattended for too long and now creaked under its own weight. The knight's path through Hallownest wound back, as many important paths do, to the place where the dead and the dreaming shared the same quiet air. In the resting grounds, blue flowers nodded gently in unseen drafts, and the lamps glowed with a light that seemed more memory than flame. The seer watched the small wanderer return again and again, dream nail in hand, carrying more essence each time, fragments of lingering thoughts gathered from whispering graves, from trees made of memory, from spirits who laughed, fretted, or sighed before finally letting go. With each offering, the dream nail grew stronger. Its blade of ghostly light extended farther. Its strike carried deeper into the sleeping world. The seer spoke more openly then, her voice carrying both gratitude and sorrow. She explained that the three dreamers had sacrificed their waking lives to hold the Radiance at bay, sinking into a sleep that would not end on its own. To end the infection, someone would need to step into their dreams and cut the anchors that kept the Radiance imprisoned inside an imperfect vessel. It was a strange mercy. To save Hallownest, the knight would have to undo the only thing still keeping it from falling completely apart. The first dreamer the knight sought lay in a place where sound itself seemed muffled by water and mist. Fog Canyon wrapped its tunnels in cloudy veils, acid pools burbled quietly below, and jellyfish drifted through the air with the vague, aimless confidence of creatures that had never worried about schedules. The night edged along narrow ledges, slipped through bubble-lit chambers, and slowly worked its way toward a structure that stood at the canyon's heart, a tower rising from a pool of crackling acid crowned with glass domes that caught the faint light. This was the teacher's archives, once the domain of Monomon the teacher. Inside, the air smelled of old experiments and trapped moisture. Scrolls and devices lay scattered, far beyond the point where tidy scholars might have pretended they were temporarily misplaced. Lightning storms flickered in the upper chambers, where a massive jellyfish-like creature pulsed and sparked in restless arcs. The night fought its way through this strange guardian, each strike sending shockwaves of light through the room, until at last the archives fell quiet again, save for the drip of acid in distant corners. At the center of the tower, suspended in a tank of liquid, floated the sleeping form of Monomon herself. Her mat was long, her body slim, and her posture peaceful in a way that felt both deliberate and resigned. Beside her stood Quirrell, the wandering scholar the knight had met before in other corners of the kingdom. He had once been Monomon's apprentice, entrusted with a piece of her mask so that he might one day help undo what she had done. Seeing the knight arrive with Dreamnail in hand, he understood, with the weary clarity of someone recognizing that the end of a long equation had finally arrived. With Quirrell's help, the seal around Monomon's tank was broken. The knight raised the Dreamnail and struck. Instead of shattering glass, the blow cut through the fabric of the teacher's sleep. In an instant, the physical archive faded, replaced by a dream space where Monomon's consciousness hung like a soft, pale lantern in the dark. The knight reached out again, this time to strike at the very idea of her, not in cruelty, but in solemn purpose. As the dreamer dissolved into essence, one of the three great seals binding the hollow knight cracked and faded. That is a real lore fact. Monomon, the teacher's body, slept in the teacher's archives, and her death in the dream realm broke her part of the seal around the black egg. When the knight returned to the waking chamber, the tank was empty. Monomon was gone, her task finished, her presence folded into the drifting currents of essence that flowed unseen through Hallownest. Quirrell stood for a long while, mask tilted in thought, as if trying to decide whether this ending felt more like a victory or a farewell. In the end, he thanked the knight with simple words and moved on, a scholar whose final homework assignment had been graded by fate rather than by any teacher's hand. The second dreamer waited much higher, above the endless reign of the City of Tears. The knight climbed spires slick with water, passed through halls where portraits of bygone nobles stared down with the polite vacancy of those long dead, and eventually found a tall tower looming over the city, the Watcher's Spire. Inside, ghosts of knighthood clung stubbornly to existence. The Watcher Knights, once defenders of the city's heart, now rolled and spun through their hall with wild, infected fury. Like a set of armored ornaments that had taken offense at their own decorative purpose. Defeating them required patience and timing. The knight danced between them, nail flashing, cloak fluttering as metal bodies crashed and rebounded. When they finally fell still, the hall grew quiet in that particular way a room does after furniture has stopped trying to kill its guests. The knight moved onward, climbing to the pinnacle of the spire, where another sleeping form lay cocooned in elaborate apparatus. Lurien the Watcher rested there, suspended before a great window that looked out over the City of Tears. In life, he had watched the kingdom ceaselessly, seeing threats and patterns from his high vantage point. Now his eyes were closed, but his dream still pressed outward, part of the triad of seals holding the Radiance's prison intact. The knight lifted the Dreamnail and struck. Once more, the waking world thinned, replaced by a dream realm where Lurien's presence hovered like a tall, silent figure peering down at everything below, even in his last moments. Ending his dream felt like extinguishing a lighthouse that had long ago lost its ships. As his form dissolved, another chain around the Hollow Knight's prison snapped. When the knight returned to the spire, Lurien's body hung slack, the tools that had once maintained his sleep, now nothing more than quiet machinery in an empty tower. Outside, the rain continued to fall without the slightest change, as if the city had decided long ago that it would weep whether someone watched or not. The third dreamer lay in a very different place, far from white towers and rainy streets. Deepness sprawled like a wound in the earth, a tangle of tunnels and webs, where the floor shifted underfoot and shadows moved with unsettling intention. The knight ventured into that maze with its nail ready and its steps careful. Here, the infection was less obvious, overshadowed by a more immediate danger. The spiders and other creatures that had always lived there, and who did not take kindly to strangers. The walls seemed alive with movement, every thread of web a possible trap, every gap between rocks an unwelcome invitation. At the heart of Deepnest lay the beast's den, a chamber thick with webs and bones, and the stale air of neglected royalty. There, surrounded by her kin, lay Hera the beast, the last of the dreamers. In life, she had ruled Deepnest and struck a bargain with the Pale King. She would become a dreamer and help seal the Radiance if he gave her a child. That child was Hornet, the same needle-wielding guardian who had tested the night in Greenpath and watched its journey with wary eyes. Hera's sleep was not peaceful exactly, but it was deep, rooted in duty and in the strange pride of someone who had given up her freedom for the sake of her people. The night stood before her, surrounded by spider shells and hanging remnants. Lifting the dream nail here felt like reaching into the heart of a family's history and quietly changing the ending. Still, the task had to be done. The blade of dreamlight struck, and once again the waking world dissolved. In the dream realm, Hera's presence felt strong and sinewy, like a web that refused to break even as it frayed. The knight's second strike finally severed it. Her form unraveled into drifting essence, and with it, the final great seal on the Hollow Knight's prison shattered. When the knight returned to the beast's den, Hera's body lay still, no longer held in enchanted sleep. Somewhere in the wet tunnels of Hallownest, Hornet felt that passing like a tug on a thread that ran straight through her, mother to daughter. Whether she grieved or simply tightened her grip on her needle, she did not say, but her vigilance over the kingdom's fate sharpened. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that with the dreamers gone, nothing now stood between the Radiance and whatever would happen next. With all three dreamers gone, the temple of the Black Egg changed. The barrier of branching marks that had once sealed its entrance flickered and thinned, like glass under spreading cracks. Inside, the great egg at its center, which had long loomed silent and impenetrable, now pulsed faintly with light. The chains of spell and dream that bound the Hollow Knight trembled, their anchors vanishing one by one. The infection, sensing the loosening of its prison, stirred with renewed ferocity throughout Hallownest. Husks grew more frantic. Orange blossoms of corruption bloomed more thickly along walls and ceilings, and the air itself seemed to hum with restless, fevered energy. The knight stood at the threshold of the temple, watching faint motes of light drift around the central shell. It understood, in its quiet, wordless way, that this was the heart of the story it had walked into. But hearts can be approached in more than one manner, and Hallownest's fate did not hinge on a single, narrow decision. From this point, the paths ahead folded and branched like veins, each carrying the night toward a different possible ending for the kingdom, for the Radiance, and for itself. How deeply it would delve into its own origins, how far into dreams within dreams it would travel, and how much of the void it would embrace. Those choices would shape the futures that lay before it, fragile as glass yet heavy as stone. From the doorway of the temple, where light from the black egg pulsed faintly like a slow heartbeat, the knight could have stepped straight in and finished the story the kingdom expected. Instead, there were other threads tugging at it, thin and persistent, leading away from that chamber and back into the deeper bones of Hallownest. Some stories do not like to end quickly, especially when there are secrets still folded in the dark. One such thread pulled the knight toward the far right edge of the kingdom, to a place where ash fell like snow and cliffs dropped away into endless white dust. This was Kingdom's Edge, a land of sharp ledges, broken arenas, and wind that carried the dry whisper of past battles. Here, in a vast hollow, where a great worm's discarded shell lay half buried, the knight met Hornet once more. She stood before the colossal ribcage, as if guarding the memory of something far larger than either of them, her needle poised, her stance the posture of someone who had absolutely no patience left for gentle warnings. Their second battle was harsher than the first. Hornet moved with even greater ferocity, weaving silken lines through the air, calling out in a voice edged with both duty and something that sounded like reluctant care. She had seen the night grow stronger, watched it wake dreamers and tread paths no ordinary wanderer could survive. Now she needed to know what it would do with that power. The duel rang through the empty arena, steel on steel, quick footfalls, brief silences when each measured the other. When at last she yielded, it was not with defeat alone, but with acceptance. In that moment, the vast, cracked shell behind her stirred with an old magic. From the cast-off remains of the worm, a symbol burned itself into the knight's carapace, the king's brand. Flames of white light marked it as heir to Hallownest in a way that had nothing to do with speeches or crowns. This is a real lore fact. The knight obtains the king's brand by defeating Hornet at the cast-off shell in Kingdom's Edge, and that mark is what allows it to open the sealed door to the abyss. With the brand, a new path opened, not upward, but down, back into the place where the knight and its countless siblings had first risen from the void. The entrance to the abyss stood at the southern edge of the kingdom, a tall door carved into stone, ringed with ancient sigils. Before, it had refused to open, like a mouth pressed tight in stubborn silence. With the king's brand blazing faintly on its shell, the knight approached and the door answered. The carvings flared white, the stone groaned, and the way down yawned wide, breathing out a cold that felt older than the kingdom itself. The knight descended, each step echoing off the walls like the repetition of an uncomfortable truth. The abyss was both familiar and new. Black void churned at the bottom of the great chasm, its surface shifting in slow waves, while pale forms lined the walls and lay scattered on ledges, vessels that had climbed once and fallen, or perhaps never moved at all. The knight moved among them like a sibling, walking a graveyard of brothers and sisters, each mask a reflection it could not quite remember wearing. Tendrils of void lashed upward when it ventured too close, reacting with hungry instinct, as if offended that anything had ever dared to leave. Deeper in, the knight set in motion old mechanisms. A distant lighthouse, if such a word could be used for something that poured darkness instead of light, awakened. When its black beam swept across the abyss, the void stilled, not in peace, but in focus. The sea at the bottom calmed, its surface turning smooth as glass. From its depths, a new power rose to meet the night. The Shade Cloak, an extension of void that slipped around its shoulders and spine like a living shadow. With it, the night could dash through barriers of infection and trust it without harm, passing through danger as if it had always been partly nothing. In a hidden place called the birthplace, the night saw more than power. It saw memory. By following faint white marks along the walls and listening to the strange hum of the dream nail against its own history, it entered a vision of the day it had been cast out. The Pale King stood at the edge of the abyss, small and rugged, watching as a vessel was carried in his arms and then dropped into the dark like a stone into water. The White Lady's presence brushed the scene, distant and sorrowful. In that vision, it became clear. The night had been one of many, a child made to be a tool, discarded when judged not perfect enough. It had climbed out anyway. With that knowledge heavy in his chest, the knight returned to the wider kingdom. But the abyss was not finished with it yet. Another path lay ahead, one that passed through the ruins of the Pale King's pride. Near the City of Tears, in a place called the Palace Grounds, a broken statue of the king lay half buried, its wings cracked, its face eroded. Touching it with the dream nail did not simply echo a thought. It opened a doorway into the memory of the White Palace, the shining fortress where the Pale King had once ruled. Inside the White Palace, the air glittered with sharp light. Platforms and saw blades moved with mechanical precision, as if the king's guilt and perfectionism had taken physical form. The knight traversed these halls of whirring danger, leaping through clouds of white thorns and narrow passages, inching ever closer to the palace's heart. There were no citizens here, no servants, only that echo of a king pacing through his own regrets, building trial after trial as if he could carve redemption into the layout of his home. It was a place where even a calm storyteller might quietly admit that the architecture had gone a little too far. At the center, the knight found a throne room where the Pale King's memory sat silent. There, amid the white geometry and fallen grandeur, the knight gathered fragments of a powerful charm, first from the White Lady in the distant Queen's Gardens, then from this palace of saws and light. Combined, those pieces formed King Soul, a charm that pulsed with the essence of both king and queen. Wearing it felt like carrying the last intention of Hallownest's rulers, their hope that something might still be salvaged from the ruins of their choices. This is another real lore fact. King Soul is assembled from two halves, one given by the White Lady and one found in the White Palace, and it later transforms into the Void Heart charm. When the knight returned to the abyss with King Soul, the reaction was immediate. The void surged, not in blind hostility this time, but in recognition. As the knight reached the lowest depths, King Soul shattered in its shell, dissolving into dark, coiling strands that sank into the night itself. The charm that replaced it was different, the Void Heart, a symbol that the knight was no longer simply touched by the void, but bound to it. The scattered shadows of its siblings responded in kind. No longer did they lash out in hostility. They quieted, drifting as if accepting that the little wanderer had become something like a voice for all of them. With the Void Heart, the knight's relationship to the kingdom subtly shifted. The Pale King's hold on it, whatever faint strand remained, snapped. It stood now not as a failed tool, but as a being chosen by the void itself. Hornet sensed this change. When she next confronted the knight near the Temple of the Black Egg, her words softened around the edges of her challenge. She acknowledged that the path ahead belonged to the knight in a way no one else could claim. The fate of Hallownest, the Radiance, and all those lost vessels in the abyss would turn on what this small figure did next. A true lore detail here. Once the knight has the void heart, certain endings are locked in, and the first, simplest ending, where it merely replaces the Hollow Knight, can no longer be obtained. From the outside, the Temple of the Black Egg looked almost peaceful. Inside, it felt like standing in the lung of a sleeping giant. The walls were lined with branching, root-like patterns of infection. In the center, chained and pierced by black spikes, stood the Hollow Knight. Its mask was cracked, its body racked by shudders it could not control. The radiance burned within it, like a sun trapped inside porcelain. When the knight stepped through the final barrier and approached, the Hollow Knight raised its nail. Whatever fragment of self was left in that vessel strained against the infection, trying to help and harm in the same broken movement, like someone reaching out and striking in the same breath. Here, the story divided into futures, like paths branching from a single door. In one possible future, the knight had come straight to this moment without delving into the abyss's deeper secrets, without claiming the void heart. It fought the Hollow Knight in a desperate, brutal duel. The larger vessel staggered, plunged its own nail into its chest at times, as if trying to tear the radiance out by force, then turned that same weapon on its smaller sibling. When at last it fell, the infection did not simply vanish. Instead, it poured into the surviving knight. Chains of spell and seal coiled around the newcomer, binding it where the Hollow Knight had once stood. The temple closed again, and the world outside remained infected, if somewhat contained. This first ending is known as the Hollow Knight. The knight defeats the Hollow Knight without void heart, absorbs the infection, and becomes the new vessel, sealing itself away while the kingdom continues its long, uneasy sleep. In another path, the knight did not come to the temple as a simple replacement key slotted into an old lock. With the void heart inside its shell, it stood there as something more complicated, no longer entirely bound to the Pale King's original design, and no longer just one more discarded experiment that had wandered back by accident. When it stepped through the shimmering membrane into the chamber and faced the Hollow Knight, it did so as a sibling who had seen the abyss, walked the White Palace in memory, and carried the weight of choices made long before either of them had names. The fight began much the same. The Hollow Knight staggered and struck, its own nail lashing out in arcs that seemed half attack, half plea. Infection burst from its wounds in orange flares. It roared, staggered back, drove its nail into its chest, as if trying to dig out the radiance with sheer self-destruction, then turned that same weapon outward again. The knight answered with practiced precision, every blow measured, a small figure moving in careful circles around a sibling who had been broken by a task no one should have been able to bear alone. Then, in this second possible future, Hornet intervened. She dropped into the chamber like a thrown needle, landing between the two vessels with a precision that said she had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her threads flashed through the air, binding the hollow night, pinning its limbs in a web of silk and resolve. For a heartbeat, she held it fast, risking herself to give the smaller night an opening. Her voice cut through the chamber, sharp as the needle in her hand, urging the sibling of void to finish what had been so imperfectly done before. The hollow night struggles as infection boiling in its chest. With a sudden convulsion, it broke free. Hornet was flung aside, her body slammed into the stone and left crumpled, mask dim, threads trailing. The night, for an instant, stood between its fallen sister of a different lineage and the towering, ruined vessel that had once been chosen in its place. There was no time for speeches. Hallownest's stories had always preferred actions over last words. The night stepped in and struck again and again until the hollow night finally fell to its knees and then to the floor, the light leaking from its cracks, dimming to a faint, trembling glow. In that ending, the infection did not surge into the night in quite the same way. The void heart within it, the acceptance of the void's nature rather than its rejection, changed how the Radiance's power settled. Still, the result was another sealed prison. The chains of spell and symbol wove themselves anew, closing around the night and the fading form of the hollow night beneath it. Outside the temple, the sigil carved into the great egg shifted. No longer did it show the tall, regal figure of the first chosen vessel. Instead, it bore the simpler, smaller outline of the knight, horns short, body slight, but now the one shouldering the burden. Hornet awoke outside, alone on the temple's steps. The infection's force across the kingdom had been pushed back, driven deeper into silence. But Hallownest remained a place of remnants, ruined so quiet, still watching the cracks in its own foundations. Hornet stood there, staring at the closed door, understanding that another sibling had sacrificed everything to keep the old light contained. Her posture in that ending was neither triumphant nor broken. It was the stance of someone who knew that the story had not been healed, only bandaged. The second ending is known as sealed siblings. With the void heart, Hornet joins the battle. The hollow night is defeated, and the night becomes the new vessel, while Hornet survives to stand guard outside the temple. Yet there was a third path, one that did not accept the old pattern of sealing and resealing as the only answer. In that possible future, when the battle with the hollow night reached its height, cracks spreading across its mask, infection bursting in terrible flares, the night did not simply continue to strike. Instead, it raised the dream nail and brought it down, not on stone or shell, but on the wounded vessel's very being. The blow sliced through the layers of spell and flesh, not to kill its sibling, but to reach past it, into the burning heart that lay behind, the Radiance herself. In an instant, the temple fell away. The night found itself standing in a realm of blinding light and clean, sharp geometry. The Radiance's home, formed not of stone, but of will and memory. The ground beneath its feet was more suggestion than rock, platforms of pale gold hanging in an endless sky of white. The Radiance towered above, a many-rayed figure blazing with furious, wounded pride. This was not the faint warmth the moths had once felt in their dreams. This was the full, unfiltered force of a being who had been forgotten, imprisoned, and forced to watch another light take her place. The battle that followed was not just a clash of nail and beam, but of natures. The Radiance hurled spears of light, summoned searing suns, flooded the air with patterns meant to overwhelm any mind trying to follow them. The night leapt and dashed, shade cloak flickering, void smearing briefly through the Radiance's attacks, like ink dragged through wet paint. Every strike it landed was a refusal to let this old light keep claiming the minds of a kingdom long past its prime, a refusal to let the same story play on repeat forever. At a critical moment, Hornet appeared again, this time in the dream itself. She pinned the Radiance's attention for a breath, giving the night space to fall deeper, to pass through the Radiance's form and plunge downward. Beneath the shining realm, the void surged upward like a black tide, answering the night's presence. The shadows of the failed vessels from the abyss rose, each a pale echo trailing streams of darkness. They swarmed around the Radiance, dragging her down, not into a cage, but into an ending. The light that had once demanded memory and worship found itself smothered by a force that did not need to be loved to exist. The Radiance struggled, flaring, her form fragmenting into shards of golden brilliance. The void swallowed each piece in turn, like an ocean reclaiming the last splinters of a broken sun. In that moment, the infection that had seeped through Hallownest's dreams lost its source. The orange blossoms withered, the restless glow in husk eyes flickered out. The trembling in the Hollow Knight's body stilled. Across caverns and cities, a long-held breath finally let itself go, leaving behind silence that was no longer heavy with waiting, but open the way a field feels after the snow has melted and gone. In this ending, the night itself was taken by the void, along with the Radiance. Its form dissolved into the black tide, not in defeat, but in union. The void heart had never been a shield, it had been a bridge. Through the night, the void reached the Radiance and ended her, and in doing so, it claimed the night fully. The vessel that had climbed from the abyss, been cast out, wandered the wastes, and returned finally became what it had always been meant to be, the point where all the discarded Mipes of the abyss came together to finish the story on their own terms. When the dream realm collapsed and the temple of the Black Egg returned to quiet, Hornet stood once more upon its threshold. This time, the sigil above the door cracked and fell away entirely. No new vessel mark replaced it. The chains were gone. The prison was empty because there was nothing left to contain. The infection had ended at its root. Hallownest remained a ruin. Yes, its king vanished, its people mostly gone, but it was no longer a kingdom held in a strained half-life. It was, at last, simply a place where things could either end or begin. This third ending is called Dream No More. The knight uses the dream nail on the Hollow Knight, while bearing the void heart, confronts the Radiance directly, and with the help of the void and its siblings, destroys her completely. In the quiet that followed the Radiance's ending, Hallownest simply existed. Its caverns still stretched out under the earth. Its bridges still arched over empty drops. Its benches still waited in small alcoves where no one sat anymore. The City of Tears went on shedding its endless rain into streets that remembered footsteps better than faces. In one reality, the Hollow Knight remained bound. In another, the night took that place. In the last, no chains were needed at all. All of those futures, lay over the kingdom like thin, transparent layers, different answers to the same aching question. What do you do with a light that refuses to be forgotten? The Radiance had wanted memory to last forever, her own image preserved in every dreaming mind. The Pale King had wanted a different kind of brightness, one that sharpened thought and carved order out of wandering instinct. Both of them feared being left behind. Both tried to pin the world in place so that what they had made would never fade. The hollow night and the countless vessels before it had been tools in that struggle, shells built to hold a story so tightly that nothing new could get in. In the end, it was the smallest wanderer, the knight who had been thrown away and climbed back, that allowed the tale to change instead of simply repeating. Memory, in Hallownest and beyond it, showed itself as something softer than either ruler had allowed. It could be a prison when held too tightly, yes, but it could also be a lantern that did not mind growing dim, or a song half remembered and hummed under the breath. To remember a kingdom did not mean you had to keep it standing. It was enough sometimes to let it rest, to know that once there had been a city of rain, a temple of chains, a cavern of green mist, and a little mask that walked among them all. Somewhere, perhaps, a bug with a good sense of humor would have said the whole saga was utterly complete, but even he would have known that no story truly ended. It just curled up for a while and slept. As the last images of Hallownest faded, the stagways gone quiet, the blue flames of the resting grounds dimming in your thoughts, the abyss smoothing over like calm ink, you were left only with the gentle weight of having listened. You did not need to carry the Pale King's guilt, or the Radiance's pride, or the Knight's steady courage with you. They could stay where they belonged, deep under stone, while you floated a little lighter above your pillow or blanket, breathing in and out as steadily as the old kingdom's forgotten tides. You could picture the knight, if you wished, sitting on a bench in some safe corner of the ruins, nail resting across its lap, shoulders finally loose. The shadows around it were not threatening anymore, just soft shapes standing guard. Above, layers of rock and soil and sky kept the noise of the surface world far away. The long story of higher beings and broken bargains had been told, and even the void seemed content to be nothing more than a dark sea that did not need to rise. Let your jaw loosen, your hands uncurl, your thoughts wander no farther than the slow drift of that tiny figure resting in the depths. Each breath could feel like a small elevator carrying you gently down through those same layers of earth into cooler air and quieter spaces, until worries and sharp edges stayed far above. If scraps of the story tried to cling, names, places, battles, you could let them soften and blur, turning into simple impressions, light and shadow, stone and rain, a lantern swinging slowly in a forgotten corridor. There was nothing left you had to solve, no choice you needed to make for the kingdom under the ground. Its endings had already unfolded. Your only task was to lie there, to let your mind be as hollow and peaceful as one of those pale masks once dreamed to be, but without any chains, without any burdens. Just an easy, drifting stillness that belonged to you alone, as natural as breathing and as quiet as a bench at the end of the world. Sweet dreams.